The following presentation was part of a forum entitled Impacts of Gas Drilling with High-Volume Hydrofracking. The forum was held at the high school auditorium in Trumansburg, New York on December 8, 2010, and sponsored by the following organizations: the Ulysses Gas Drilling Advisory Board, the Coalition to Protect New York, and the Committee to Preserve the Finger Lakes.
Our next presenter is Sandra Steingraber. Sandra is a scholar in residence at Ithaca College. She earned her doctorate in biology from the University of Michigan and also holds a master's degree in English from Illinois State University. An ecologist, author, and cancer survivor, Sandra studies the impacts of environmental toxins on human health. In the book and film Living Downstream, she documented her personal experience with cancer and chemical contaminants in our air, water, and land. In the past year, Sandra has been exploring hydrofracking for her column in Orion magazine, as well as for her forthcoming book on environmental threats to children's development. She will focus on the effects of fracking on air, water, and farming, with a special emphasis on the ecology and public health of rural communities. She lives in Trumansburg. Are you comfortable with this here?
Well, thank you. It's a real honor to be here in my own hometown and speaking, and thanks to all who pulled this event together tonight. I know it's a lot of work goes on behind the scenes to have an event like this, so thank you. I have had the opportunity this year to speak about fracking in a briefing in the U.S. Congress. I was invited to the White House after the President's Cancer Panel report was released last spring, and spoke about fracking to the White House Office on Science and Health Policy. I just returned from Belgium and had the opportunity to talk about cancer and the environment to both the EU Parliament and the Commission, and spoke about fracking in those fora as well. And I'm more nervous tonight here in my own village than I am when I was in the Parliament. I don't know why, but the reason that it's become a focus of my research and writing is because I think it is one of the biggest environmental health issues of our time. And so let me share with you some of the research that I've done this year on the environmental health effects. And so first, I think I'll back up a little bit and just introduce you to the Marcellus Shale. I know a lot of us are new to the issue, and we might feel like we've walked in the middle of a movie. So if you're not kind of au courant on all the technical details of what fracking is, I'll kind of give a little introduction here. So beneath our feet, a few thousand feet, about half a mile or so, is a layer of shale called the Marcellus, and it was actually created around 500 million years ago, so long ago that there weren't a lot of trees on Earth, and there wasn't a lot of oxygen yet in the atmosphere. And there was a big mountain range at that time called the Acadian Range, which was located kind of east of here. Over time, over the millennia, that mountain range eroded into the shallow ocean that overlay the Marcellus. And so all that silt kind of sank into the ocean floor together with the remains of all the living creatures that lived in the shallow ocean. And those included things like mollusks and squid and sea lilies. So the Marcellus Shale is really a graveyard, and it turned to shale under pressure, all those sediments, and formed a kind of chalkboard about the size of Florida. And all the plankton and animals that were trapped inside became bubbles of methane. And so what natural gas really is kind of a euphemism for methane and other lightweight hydrocarbons. It's basically the vaporous form of petroleum. And because eroding mountains also shed elements, this shale captured uranium. It's quite radioactive. Mercury, arsenic, and lead, and all of those things, of course, are heavy metals. And as long as they're trapped inside the geological strata and separated from us, they don't hurt anybody. They hold rightful places in the periodic chart of elements, so they're natural elements. But when you bring them up out of the ground, arsenic is a known bladder carcinogen. That caught my attention because bladder cancer, in fact, is the kind of cancer that I had. And of all human cancers, it's the one most likely to recur Cancer is the most expensive thing that can happen to you as a patient, and bladder cancer turns out to be the most expensive kind of cancer that you can have. So any exposure to arsenic raises very serious sorts of health risks. Arsenic is also a developmental neurotoxicant, which means in early life it can actually alter the way neurons are wired together inside the brain of a child in ways that lead to learning disabilities. And of course, lead is even more well known for its ability to sabotage child brain development, and mercury has the same effect. So down under the shale, not only are bubbles of methane, but are metals that are known to sabotage fetal brain development. And so down there under the ground, it's about a temperature that approximates the low setting on an oven, around 140 degrees or so. And so for all these millions of years then, these bubbles of methane and this sediment and these heavy metals have kind of lain bound together. And of course, there's a lot of brine from the old ocean water that's down there. And then, of course, our drinking water aquifers lay on top of all this. So the Marcellus Shale holds all these bubbles, and all together, that's the largest natural gas deposit in the United States. And so this subterranean landscape has now become ground zero for this newish form of energy extraction called high-volume slick water hydraulic fracturing. And as you probably understand, that vertical drilling for natural gas is kind of an established process, but until the last decade or so, capturing all these kind of unconnected gas bubbles in a horizontal formation like the Marcellus was not really economically feasible. What I kind of imagine all these gas bubbles to look like down there is kind of a fizz of bubbles in a petrified spill of champagne. And so to get all those bubbles to flow, you have to actually shatter, break open, and fracture our bedrock. And that's what slick water hydrofracturing does. So first, the steel pipe goes down and then turns sideways and drills horizontally through the formation. And then these cement casings are laid, not through the whole of all the drill, but just part. It covers part of that steel pipe, and then explosives are detonated in the horizontal pipe to perforate it and to begin the process of fracturing the shale. And then at that point, a slurry of water, sand, and chemicals has to go down, and then under enormous pressure. This, like some have compared it to using a baseball bat to shatter a windshield. You force it into the fractured shale and fracture it even further. And the chemicals, and there are hundreds of them that drillers can choose from, serve several purposes. And most notably, they reduce friction because the borehole is actually quite small. And so if you're exerting the kind of pressures that are needed to actually shatter shale, you can imagine that the pressure is going to be very intense. And so to reduce the drag on the side of the borehole, you have to kind of reduce the friction. And in addition, then, the mixture includes acids and gelling agents, rust and scale inhibitors, and pesticides to kill microbes. They're actually living creatures that live way down under the earth and feed on the hydrocarbons in underground formations. And these bacteria can slime up the inside of pipes. And so there are these very powerful, some call them biocides, you can call them pesticides, that also go down. And sometimes these fracking fluids include toluene, which is another chemical that's known to be a developmental neurotoxicant. In other words, it's a brain poison. So then up the borehole flows the gas, along with the cocktail of water and chemicals that have been forced into the fractured rock. But not all of it comes up. Some 40 to 70% actually stays behind in the rubble. there are some things that we know for sure about the environmental health effects of fracking, and there are some things, because this is a new process and we don't have another planet Earth to go try this out on anywhere, we're discovering as we go along. So there's some uncertainties, and then there are some sure things that will be consequences. So I'm going to run through both with you. So the first sure thing is that hydrofracking will represent the industrialization of our rural landscape here. There's no such thing as a little bit of hydrofracking, even as there's no such thing as being a little bit pregnant. And that's because in order to make it economically profitable to get this methane out of the ground, you have to have an economy of scale. So it has to be done to lay all this infrastructure. You have to kind of do it everywhere. It's a real shock and awe kind of operation. And of course, our land here is full of farms and vineyards. It's our state's food shed and wine growing country. It's where cows are on pasture, and it contains some of the largest forest canopy in the Northeast. And if it goes forward here, it will represent the biggest ecological change since the original forests here were cleared. And Bill and Sandy Poldolka have been very thoughtful in their analysis of the impact on our habitat, and as an ecologist, that's what initially caught my attention. And so we have to ask ourselves, I think, as residents of this place, whether or not the kind of activities that go on here that we enjoy are compatible with fracking. For example, there are chemicals in fracking fluid that are chemicals that are released into air that are quite toxic to alfalfa, for example. Alfalfa is very sensitive to air pollution. So the question becomes, can we still be a dairy state and also do fracking? And the questions kind of go on from there. Another sure thing is that fracking requires tremendous amounts of water. So there are millions of gallons that go down every single well with every frack. And somewhere between 34,000 wells and 90-some thousand wells are planned for, are envisioned for upstate New York. And so with an average of, let's say, 4 million gallons for every well, you can see how many zeros you end up with. It's an enormous amount of number. And remember, half of that water is going to be locked up underground forever. So fracking represents the dewatering of our watershed. And this, of course, will threaten amphibians and fish from the dewatering of streams. Fracking threatens migratory birds because their habitat will be fragmented. And it will raise the risk for flooding. Anytime you fragment a habitat, then you compact the soil. You have a lot less spongy earth left to soak up floodwaters. And so we will almost certainly experience more flooding if fracking goes forward. Sure thing number 2. Even if accidents never happen, we will have air pollution. And no matter how ideal the regulations are that you just heard, there's no way to regulate the air pollution. Every well requires thousands of truck trips, requires compressors, requires generators, and all of these things run on diesel and will fill the rural air with the combustion byproducts of diesel engines. That's just unavoidable. There's just no regulating that away. And we're learning a lot more about diesel exhaust. It is a carcinogen. It is also full of ultrafine particles, and these can be inhaled deep into the lung. And air pollutants now have been linked to not only the things you might think of, such as lung cancer and emphysema, but also diabetes. It can alter the cardiac rhythm of your own heart by interfering with the neurons in the vagus nerve. And it is linked to stroke and cardiac, as well as asthma in children. So almost certainly our asthma rates will go up. Air pollution, especially vehicle exhaust, is linked to preterm birth. So premature birth is a problem when it goes up whenever air pollution levels rise. And of course, preterm birth is our leading cause of disability. It's also one of the most expensive things that can happen to a person and can set a person up for lifelong medical and educational problems. We know that these emissions accompany every stage of the fracking process, from clearing timber to building the well pads to hauling away the toxic flowback water. And of course, some of the beloved rural roads that we ride our bikes along, our two-lane highways, the road we call Main Street that our children walk to school along, they will be filled with these big semi-rigs too, and a lot of them will be hauling toxic chemicals. And again, these can't be regulated away. Sure thing number 3 is accidents do happen, especially during industrial activities that involve explosive vapors. Holding ponds and waste pits leak, gas pockets explode, blowout protectors fail, chemicals spill, trucks hauling toxic liquids crash. And these things too are not entirely regulatable. Another sure thing is this. Fracking makes water disappear, and I think this is really worth thinking hard about. Usually when we say that water is being wasted, because let's say you're leaving the tap on while you're brushing your teeth, we really don't mean that water is leaving the water cycle. Remember, rain recharges groundwater, and groundwater is the mother of rivers. Rivers flow to the ocean, and when oceans evaporate and become clouds and then become rain again, that's the water cycle. And wasting water might draw down a reservoir or deplete an aquifer, but really we're just transferring that water to another place, and it might end up falling on the ships at sea or something, but it's not really going away. Conversely, fracking constitutes what's called consumptive water use, which is different than when you leave the tap running when you brush your teeth. When water is entombed under deep geological strata a mile or more beneath the earth, it's trapped forever. It's removed from the water cycle. It will no longer ascend into clouds or freeze into snowflakes. It won't melt in the spring. It won't flow from your tap or rise through roots. It won't ever become blood or urine or milk or sap or nectar or honey or the juice of a fruit. It will never swell a bud or quench a thirst or fill a swamp. It will never dribble, spray, splash, drip, or glisten. It will never again be fog, mist, frost, ice, dew, or rain. It will be gone. And you wouldn't want it to come back because it's poisonous now. And that's something to think hard about, because we're entering a period of time where almost everyone, from scientific communities to the State Department, is predicting water shortages and the need to preserve water resources for uncertain times ahead. And do we really want to be making our precious water disappear under deep geological strata? So those are the sure things that we can say about the environmental health risks of fracking. In fact, they're not really risks. They're things that will just happen. The risks come with the uncertainties. And one of them is the question that's on a lot of people's minds: can fracking contaminate groundwater? And the answer depends on part on what's meant by fracking. If we're only talking about the moments during which the shale is actually fractured, that's one thing. But if we're talking about the entire process from beginning to end, that's another. And if we are talking about the whole process, then it is true that there are confirmed cases of water contamination with compounds associated with gas development. So it has happened in other places. And everything, of course, depends on the integrity of these steel and cement encased wells, which have to bisect our aquifers on the way down to the shale below. And so we need to know that there's no room for error at all when these casings are sunk through our drinking water aquifers. And so we need to know that the external surface of every well bore that pierces a water supply can always be trusted to remain an unbreachable barrier to the substances flowing up and down its interior surface forever. If a single cracked well bore can bring eternal and irremediable ruin to our drinking water, how would we ever know that happened? So there has to be some kind of way to prevent every single well from cracking. And there's a story out of Pavilion, Wyoming, that's particularly instructive here. Those folks are living in a gas patch with 211 active gas wells, and the water did fill up with chemicals used in the fracking process, to the point where the EPA and the Agency on Toxic Substance and Disease Registry found petrochemicals in 20 wells and finally recommended that people stop drinking the water. And nevertheless, they're still unable to actually link beyond a shadow of a doubt those chemicals to particular gas wells, because in Pavilion, Wyoming, as in almost everywhere else in the world, the subterranean world of groundwater flow is uncharted and mysterious. And so it's hard to know if this well is contaminated, that it came from that well over there, because we don't know everything about how groundwater flows. The other uncertain thing is what's in the fracking fluid itself. The chemicals are mysterious because the formula right now is proprietary. You heard from Lou that fracking is exempt from most of our major environmental regulations, and this was achieved by the lobbying from the energy industry, and Halliburton itself received a special loophole for fracking from the Safe Drinking Water Act and as part of the 2005 Energy Policy Act, and that allows fracking to use toxic chemicals and inject them into the ground without revealing the identity of those chemicals. Any other kind of activity that involves toxic chemicals going into the ground have to be public knowledge. So we don't know everything about it, but some researchers have analyzed the fluid found in the flowback water and pieced together the best document we have on the potential chemicals that are used in fracking fluid, and they're quite frightening. At the same time, a lot of those nasty chemicals that are bound up in the shale come back up with the flowback water. So these things include benzene, which is a known carcinogen, of course the brine that's underneath there, and all the various radioactive elements. And here in this area, our shale is quite radioactive. That's why we have radon problems. And so, will the radon in our basements increase, in our homes increase, if the shale is shattered and more radon can go through these fissures? Again, that's a big question mark. Nobody exactly knows the answer to that. So those are some of the answered and unanswered questions for us, I think, all as a community to consider. I'll close by reading a short paragraph from a piece of writing I've done on fracking in which I consider how to think about these things. So I began to think about what the best comparison was to compare fracking to something we know, and I decided that alcoholism would be a good metaphor for this. Natural gas is, of course, we think about it as the blue flame under our stove is the way to heat our home, but much of natural gas is actually the feedstock for a lot of our materials industry, and so 5% of it is actually turned into anhydrous ammonia, which is synthetic fertilizer. It's the beginning point for PVC plastic and a lot of pesticides. So it occurred to me by raising the supply and lowering the cost of all these plastics and pesticides, are we not perpetuating a petrochemical-based economy of the kind that many of us have moved here to find another way, to find organically grown food and renewable energy? And so what does it mean to frack our land and make more available more petrochemicals? So here it is. The language of addiction is often invoked in conversations about our economy's desperate relationship with fossil fuels. And up to a point, this is a useful way to frame the problem, especially when pondering the irrationalities of shale gas drilling and our own enabling behaviors that drive the need for it. Consider the drunk who has already cashed out his kid's college fund, hawked the family heirlooms, burned the furniture, and terrified the dog. He's beginning to grasp that he has a problem. He's also running out of whiskey. He flirts with the idea of Alcoholics Anonymous. But wait, he suddenly discovers a fully loaded wine cellar buried deep beneath the basement of his house. Falling in love with his own cleverness, he begins to lay plans to blow up the foundation to get it. Overhearing this news, his alarmed family members hold an emergency meeting. What will they decide to do? Stay out of his way and pretend there is no problem? Help him get the wine and then regulate the consumption of it? Insist on overseeing the detonation of the basement? Or will they bar the way to the cellar steps? Thank you.
One of the statistics that you brought up was that 40+% of the water that we used, that includes all of these chemicals, remains in the ground. Even in a perfect world, then, it makes sense to me to think that if there was a 100% fail-safe system in place, our planet is a geologically ever-changing hunk of rock. I'm wondering that even in perfect situation, there really is no way to control the possibility of contamination. Is that correct or not?
Well, okay, as a biologist, I'm not sure I can. Obviously, we can't say absolutely not. We can never say those things. And we've never done anything like this before, placed inherently toxic substances that far under the ground in large volumes, especially after shattering shale, and know that from time immemorial that shale is going to safely contain those things and it's not going to find its way up to an aquifer. What I can say that we do have some evidence for is what happens so in other words, we don't know anything about contamination from below. However, we have many examples of contamination of aquifers from above. And Endicott, New York is a great example. There are many, many chemicals that found their way into the drinking water supply in Endicott, and we have no understanding of exactly how they got there. They shouldn't have been able to do that, but there they are. Similarly, there are plumes of contamination in Cape Cod. We can't trace it back to its origin. It doesn't make sense to us. And even here in New York, with the PCB contamination of the Hudson, part of the PCBs were actually dumped by GE into the river, but plenty of others found their way into the Hudson through the shale bedrock, right? Because the GE built its plant right on top of a shale, and some of the PCBs sank through the factory floor through natural fissures in the bedrock of the shale and found their way up underneath the river. And it took us a long time to understand that that could happen. So I guess what I'm saying is that we're not very good at predicting how groundwater flows. You heard that from Lou. And even when we were faced with simple problems, when you contaminate groundwater from above and try to trace the plume, we're often surprised at where contaminants end up. Whether or not chemicals entombed that far beneath geological strata could find their way up through vaporization, because remember, it is warm down there, so things can vaporize, and find their way up through fissures, I can't say yes and I can't say no. We just have no evidence for something like this happening, because this is something truly new under the sun. My geologist friends tell me that their concern is not so much these natural fissures, but all these thousands of abandoned gas wells that were sunk, the vertical wells that were sunk as exploratory wells and abandoned years ago. We don't have any map of where they are, but they're like little cocktail straws, right, sticking down into the ground all over New York State. So is it possible that if we're forcing under an immense pressure all this toxic fluid, that one of those could flow underneath the surface and find one of these old abandoned wells and come spurting up to the surface? I know that geologists are worried about that, but there's just no evidence, yes or no, for as far as I know, for something like that happening.
Okay, but I think that my question really more is concerned about natural events, things that even if all of the engineers under the sun have come up with a way of being able to say, okay, we have a surefire way of being able to protect the environment. We really don't have any control over natural geological events
Right.
that could alter that.
That's true.
Okay.
I'm afraid that's all the time we have right now for this one. I apologize.